Hey guys, welcome back to the Lou Perez Podcast. My name is Lou Perez. If you'd like to support the podcast, please head over to thelouperez.locals.com and join the Lou Perez community. You get to listen to podcasts early and you get to watch some sketch comedy early as well. So please head over there. I need you. I need you so much. Also, I got something you guys need right now too, and that's my next guest. Please give it up for Mr. Christopher Ferguson, author of How Madness Shaped History, as well as a professor at Stetson University, is it?
It's Stetson University. It's named after the hat guy. That's the one.
There we go. When you told me about that, I was thinking if there might be a competition with the Fedora Community College or something like that.
That would be awesome. I'd be all for that. Yeah,
the old rivals. So your book, How Madness Shaped History, just came out, right? Not too long ago.
It came out at the best possible time, which is at the beginning of the pandemic. No, I'm kidding. It's like the worst possible time for a book to come out, which I learned because everybody, like the whole publishing house is closed. You know.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, my book's shipping out. Well, I don't know. We're in isolation, so it was this real strange time for the book to come out for sure. Not that my problems with my book are the same as a lot of other people's going through this, but it came out around March of 2020. So it's been out for a little bit now.
Yeah, around that time everybody was hoarding hand sanitizer and bullets and
toilet paper.
And toilet paper. So yeah, it would be bad. I mean, I gotta say it's a hardcover. This is not gonna feel good as toilet paper. So you made it.
You have to worry about splinters.
Exactly. But that must be weird though. I mean, talking about madness during a pandemic, and one of the things that I struggled with was basically trying to figure out where the science ended and paranoia began. Especially at that point in time when at least the general public knew so little about this novel coronavirus. And did you notice anything in particular about sort of on a mass scale of how people were responding to what was happening?
Badly, yeah. I mean, it definitely is a good example of kind of society, the whole world in some respects, kind of going mad. You kind of look at we made the joke about the hoarding of toilet paper, but you kind of think about it, like going into a pandemic, and you think about how the hand sanitizer makes sense, and the disinfectant kind of makes sense for people to kind of hoard that stuff. But toilet paper, I mean, is no real reason to think that society is going to crash to the extent that we won't have toilet paper. But it's an interesting example because I remember this happening. I remember like watching this video of, it was, two women, I think, this might've been like late February before it really became clear just how bad things were going to be. And these women were just sort of fighting over, one individual had, stacked her shopping cart just full of toilet paper, and the other woman just wanted one roll. And of course it started getting into something very close to a physical confrontation. And like a dummy, I'm sitting there thinking like, these people are, we're not gonna have to worry about toilet paper. This is a stupid thing to worry about in a pandemic. What I kind of fail to realize is once, a small percentage of people start to do that, start to hoard something, even if it's ridiculous, even if there's no good rational reason to hoard that, then a second wave of people are going to come behind that and say, well, the first wave is hoarding this, so we should probably hoard it too. Otherwise, and then a third wave will watch them do it. And eventually everybody has to do it, so even if, you kind of like, my situation, you start kind of going, well, that's kind of, we don't have to worry about, I'm not gonna run out of toilet paper. Soon enough, we are running out of toilet paper. And then we're all had to be like, I had to go along with it, too. So some of that stuff, looking at how society, responded to the pandemic, the whole, debate over, our masks tyranny, the whole thing about, sort of the George Floyd killing and the reaction to that. I mean, all these things are kind of woven together in some respects, and I mean, the reality is that people don't always know how to interpret information, how to deal with an extreme event like this pandemic. And I think it kind of showed, even with the leadership of the country and, a lot of countries, that there's a lot of, even psychology. I mean, initially the reaction from a lot of psychologists was, in the popular press, when they would, talk to reporters who do not op-eds, were kind of like, don't worry about it. People always overestimate the risk of pandemics and diseases, and so even as psychologists, we don't look real good.
Yeah.
Kind of coming out of this.
At what point does at what point is it technically a mob or like mob mentality? Because I had a joke where I was saying, I don't like parades or riots. I don't like very large gatherings of people. With a parade, people are hanging around like actually waiting for action, and I almost feel like when it comes to like that instant before a riot, it's sort of there's something that's going to happen to just set things off. Maybe you talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like mobs happen under like two circumstances I can kind of think of off the top of my head. One is when any given individual doesn't really know what the right thing to do is, and so they start to look around and try to figure out what everybody else is doing. And two, when there's a sense of, well, I don't have any personal responsibility in this, that I'm just part of the crowd, and so nobody's going to pick me out of the crowd necessarily. So we kind of can lose our individuality in those situations. But there's a lot of psychology experiments that kind of look at how people behave when they're in a group. And there's these studies where they kind of set like one person up to be in a group of people, and all the other people are in on the experiment, right? And these other people will do something or say something that is obviously ridiculous or untrue, and that one person who's not in on it, who really is the actual participant, will tend to kind of go along with what the crowd is doing. We tend to kind of conform to what everybody else is doing, and it can become worse, if you will, if there's a moral component to it. So if there's a sense of like, you're a bad person if you don't do what everybody else is doing. And I kind of remember, like, again, the early days of the pandemic. I think it was the NBA. I'm not a big sports person at all. My wife actually, in fact, my wife is watching a hockey game right now. She's a big sports person. So I remember it was, again, so like early March, mid-March, somewhere in there, and the NBA canceled their season, right? And that probably was the right thing to do. I mean, I'm not a public health person, so I'm not doubting that at all. But once they did it, it was very clear that like everybody else was going to have to cancel everything too at that point. Not in the sense of public health, but nobody wanted to be, that guy who waited, for more information, and then somebody died, which is understandable. I'm not questioning that decision. But when there is that kind of pressure, then you can see people kind of like go with the flow because they don't want to seem like they're bucking the moral trend, if you will.
It's so interesting that that you bring up that experiment about, I guess it would be kind of like a conformity experiment, because I remember I was in grade school and we went on a school trip, and I forget where we went exactly, but the whole class was basically sitting in a circle, and me and my best friend Reggie, who both of us actually happen to have the same birthday as well, February 26th. It's coming up, ladies and gentlemen. We were told to leave the room, right? So we left the room, then we came back, and then there were a series of questions that were asked, and the response was, if you believe it was true, you're supposed to raise your hand. And something I noticed, and I don't remember what the exact questions were, but the answer was wrong. It was just flatly wrong. It was like the idea of, it's a bright sunny day, and then everybody in the room is saying, yes, it's raining outside, and they raise their hand, and we were looking around, and I was really and I was a kid, I didn't know what was going on, but I like to, I'm happy to say that I passed without conforming to the herd, and I think my friend did as well. It might have been that maybe the two of us were kind of looking at each other like, this doesn't seem right, and it was only after that I guess the purpose of the test was told to us. But it is really interesting how that happens, and I find it sometimes I spend a lot of my life on social media, and sometimes I'll come across, say, like a post, and I'll say, oh, I agree with that, but hold on, let me see the person posting this, let me see what they have in their bio to see if they're a true ally, and all that. And that's it's odd, but I get it, and it kind of makes sense. But I don't know how to fight against that on a mass scale in particular.
Yeah, well, it's tricky these days too. I mean, you're talking about social media because, of course, at least we're seeing some anecdotal examples of people that are being judged for exactly the same thing. That you end up liking. So you see a random post comes by and they say, "I enjoy chocolate cake," and you hit retweet. And it
Mhm.
turns out it was, I don't know, the Nazi party president, I don't know, so some horrible human being, right? And it ends up being like, oh, you retweeted, this like horrible human being. Yeah, because he said he liked cake. I don't
Mhm.
know. I don't know who he was. So that is a thing. I mean, there is this kind of like weird currency now, particularly in social media. And social media works very differently from the way the real world does. But there is this kind of sense of like you do have to almost be careful not to like or retweet something from the wrong person. And even though in many situations we may not really, I see these kitten videos, that pop up on Twitter every so often. I like cats,
Mhm.
so I'll like retweet these cat videos. But yeah, I don't know. Is it like the Communist Party of China that's sending out kitten videos? I don't know. I mean, you're probably wise. I don't really even check, so people are going to be, accusing me someday of like, oh, you enjoy communist kittens. Okay, so
Well, I know in your book you talk about specifically how social media is amplifying the fringes. As long as you've been teaching, what have you noticed, or what impact has social media had on what's going on?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, so it's interesting. I think people tend to worry about the wrong things about social media. So you hear a lot about, the idea that kids are on social media too long and that's causing suicide and mental health problems. And there's actually not really strong evidence for that. The idea that, at least, spending time, if you're looking at time spent as a variable, there doesn't seem to be much evidence to suggest that time spent in social media necessarily is causing like teen suicide or mental health problems or things like that. Now, what you do with it, I mean, if depending upon the kind of activities you're engaged in, if you're doom scrolling for hours and hours, that might be a little bit different. But
What is
generally
that?
speaking,
Doom scrolling? What is? Would you
doom
just?
scrolling. Okay, so I have to like try to define one of these internet terms now. Doom scrolling is basically when you kind of like keep looking through social media and you're upset about something and you keep looking for more information about that thing you're upset about. Like, I don't know, they've canceled your favorite television show and you're just like super, super upset. You just keep looking for more and more information about, are they going to bring it back? No. What about now? They're going to bring it back now? No, it's only been like half an hour.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm using a very mild example of that, but that
Sure.
can be over any major event, politics, whether you're following Trump or Biden, all that kind of stuff. Just look, rather most of us want to say like we're not having fun, so we break off and go do something else. This is like really like causing more anxiety and stuff. But some people sometimes when they get on social media will just keep doing it. They'll just keep looking for more and more information. Or they get into an argument, and rather than just saying, you know what, this is a stupid fight on Twitter, and it's really ruining my day or my weekend or whatever else, I just stop.
Mhm.
They'll just keep doing it, without.
Well, there is there's obviously a mental component to it, but that mental component has a physical there's a physical side effect to that too. I've been really amped up and angry online, and there's a part of me that likes it. It's like, ooh, I'm really enjoying this. The other day I had to pull myself back from really laying into this woman I went to high school with. It's like, oh, I could have really just, just laid into her on Facebook. But fortunately, there was better angels of my nature were able to pull
Yeah.
me back from the brink.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, the hope is that more and more people will do that. But yeah, there is this sense of, I mean, we're an aggressive species. We like aggression. I mean, I think what you're kind of talking about is exactly, that it's easy to get drawn into it. uh, because there's a part of us that I think like inherently likes to defeat someone else, and especially if it's on social media, we're not seeing the other person, they belong to some other camp or tribe or whatever that we already don't like. It can very, easily feel like we get drawn into these what are really are, if you think about stupid fights, but
Mhm.
at the moment you feel like you're like stopping the communists or stopping the Nazis. I mean, there is this kind of rhetoric around a lot of these stupid internet fights, and I think in the moment people sort of earnestly think it's true. um but that kind of comes down to like, again, I don't think that the real problems with social media are, causing mental health problems, but there is this sense of, a lot of these, the models seem to be built on this idea of throwing the most, emotionally evocative things in front of us, and getting us to react to that, and then keeping us involved in those sorts of activities. And there is this sense of, it can amplify. I mean, the people that are most prone to doing this is kind of, are people that likely have some struggles in their personal life, or, in their mental health or whatever else. That's sometimes to think about when we're actually engaging in some of these stupid internet fights with someone we may not know, is that they may be really struggling with some issues, and grinding them into the ground may not be the kindest thing for us to do. But it also can give these more extreme voices on either side of any given debate the perception like they speak for a majority, that if they are the ones that, companies are hearing, or politicians are hearing, or other groups of people are hearing, then there is this sense of, and that kind of comes down back to this like mobbing on Twitter. And so, people react to it. They say, like, all these people on Twitter are angry about something, so it must be something that's worth being angry about. And oftentimes that's, 1% of people on Twitter, which is something like, I don't know, was it like 5% of people in the real world? So it's a very, very narrow opinion that has this, amplified sense of power in real life. So that, I think, is part of the trouble that we're having with social media now, is the extent to which companies, politicians, and stuff are taking Twitter seriously, and think that, like, if there was a book, Abigail Shrier's, what was it called? God, I can't remember the name of it all of a sudden. Irreversible Damage. It was about, trans individuals and stuff. And there were a couple people, I mean, there are a lot of people don't like the book, some people consider it to be transphobic and stuff, and that's fair. But some people try to get it banned, by posting things to Target on Twitter, or at least, but when I say banned, I mean that Target wouldn't sell it at any rate. And initially Target went with that. A few people kind of complained on Twitter. So Target initially, said that they weren't going to sell the book anymore. And then there was a backlash, and then they decided to sell it again. But there is that sense of, like, a few people get angry on social media, and that can have some real impacts on the rest of us, in ways that are large and, and small. And I think that's really going to be like one of the biggest things, in addition to, of course, the various privacy issues that have been going on for a while, and just the fact that, how much power these big tech providers have over speech right now. I think those things are going to be like the main issues, the main challenges we're going to have with social media, not so much this idea that teenagers are committing suicide or becoming depressed because of their time on social media.
Wow. So there seems like there's nothing good, where it's like, if the best that we could hope for is that teenagers aren't committing suicide. Like, all right, great, fantastic. And then it's like, oh man, what comes next? So you write your book. It's released in March 2020. Holy shit, so much has happened between the release of your book and now. If you had to go back and like rewrite stuff, or if you have to write a new forward or something like that, what are some things that you need to address?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, obviously 2020 is going to be a special year in history. There's no question about that. It's certainly in my lifetime, I think, like, everybody for as long as I can remember, I've always said, like, 2017 was the worst year. I can't wait for 2018. Now, like, well, I love 2017, at this point. I wish I could go back to that. So everybody kind of thinks, like, any given year is the worst year ever. I think 2020 is going to be a hard one to, at least within the last 50 years or so. It's going to be a hard one to compete with. I mean, a lot of terrible things happen. I mean, and I think a lot of them really kind of draw back to COVID-19. I mean, I think that a lot of the things that did happen, even other events that were traumatic or were negative, all of them kind of draw back to some extent to COVID-19. If you kind of look at, like, the events after George Floyd's killing in late May, the protests, the riots, the looting, however you want to kind of define that. My suspicion is that a lot of that also reflected some of the, the anxiety, the angst of being isolated, frustrations over unemployment and such that came out after COVID-19. So it's hard to say definitively, but my guess is that, the reaction to George Floyd's killing might have been different had COVID-19 not been going on at the same time. And same thing with the presidential election in November. It's hard to know if it hadn't been for COVID-19, would Donald Trump have been reelected? I mean, I don't know. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. I'll be very upfront and
well,
say
you
that.
have to say that.
Yeah.
Anywhere you go, you must make that very clear.
It's a reflex now. It's like cough. I hate Donald Trump. But I'm in print. Kind of saying that already. So pretty well established. I think that he would have certainly had a much better chance of having been reelected in 2020 had the COVID-19 epidemic not have happened. If he got reelected, then there wouldn't have been the whole controversy about him claiming that the election was stolen, the January 6th mobbing of the Capitol, so on and so forth. So I think you would have been working.
Yeah, you would have been working with because I think up until COVID hit, I think like the economy was booming and unemployment was very low. And just to go back about the unrest after the killing of George Floyd, it is an interesting case too, because that killing seemed like something that both the left and the right were united on. Like I remember seeing very much Blue Lives Matter people saying, whoa, what happened here was wrong. So it's sort of like, for that to be the powder keg that blew this up, it's like wow, I think people being stuck inside, unemployment, all of that had so much to do with it. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a complicated situation. I think it'll take time for people to really kind of parse out. I mean, one of the things people are kind of like talking about now is one of the things, I think in the last few days even came out that the homicide rate for 2020 was much higher than it went up. I think they're saying like 25%, which is a massive jump. This is a preliminary data, of course, and already there's arguments about like, well, what caused it? Was it COVID-19 that, resulted in, higher homicide rates, because people are kind of stuck together and, you get some increase in domestic homicides and that kind of stuff. Or was it, the sort of pullback of police after the George Floyd killing? And, of course, it's complicated, right? It's not necessarily any one thing or any other thing. It's probably a complicated mix of these things. But, I mean, there is this kind of like parallel universe somewhere where COVID-19 didn't happen. And I think it would be, I think we still have some of the struggle, some of the culture war stuff was happening obviously before COVID-19, but I think COVID-19 made everything more acute for people. And it gave people a lot of time is the other thing, because of unemployment, so people had a lot more time to protest or to get involved in various social cultural issues on either side, so because people didn't have jobs and they were frustrated. They wanted to go outside.
I'm definitely not the only person that was disappointed, where I thought maybe this would bring people together. Maybe if people had more time, if people, had to really ponder mortality in their existence, that it really would change. But then it's like, nah, man, you got endless scrolling on your phone. You don't need that. There's no mortality when you could just keep scrolling. There's no reason to really to look into that stuff. But you bring up a really good point about when people are going to look back on 2020 or the years leading up to it. It's complicated, but I'm wondering, are we going to be able to actually have a nuanced conversation that takes, that takes stock of all the complexity? Are we able to do that? Because an example of something recent, a little while ago, I remember where people were being called conspiracy theorists for saying, oh, it seems like coronavirus might have been grown, like made in a lab, like it might be that. And people are, you're out of your mind, conspiracy theories, you're watching too many movies. And now apparently that hypothesis is gaining like real traction with legit people, and like, hey, you know what? It has all these markers of something that could have been lab made, whether it was, released into the, into the, into the world, who knows? But it's like, wow, look at that flip. You went from only nutcases could possibly fathom this to, oh, we might want to check that out, especially for future, for future stuff that might happen.
Well, it can be really hard to sort of parse things in the moment, when people are going through it. I mean, kind of like the only other parallel really in my lifetime was the 9/11, 2001 sort of event. If you kind of think, how people, and granted, society responded very differently, to that. You were talking about like unity, right? And there was like enormous unity after 9/11, which we didn't see after COVID-19. So it's a very, very different reaction to that. Now, some of that unity after 9/11 wasn't good because we ended up with the Iraq War and stuff. And there really was, I mean, it's kind of one of the things that was interesting about like 9/11 is at the time, there was a lot of pushback that you couldn't challenge the president, you couldn't challenge the government, that you couldn't worry about like, the Patriot Act and the concerns about the security state.
It's called the Patriot Act. How can you'd be unpatriotic to
exactly? How can you not like something called the Patriot Act, right? This is the genius of politics, right? Is you can have a bill that like raises taxes and slaughters kittens and makes slippers out of them, and as long as you call it the I Love Children Act, then it's going to be really hard for people to kind of challenge
and
that.
Chris Ferguson will not be liking those on Twitter. He likes cats. He doesn't like cat mittens and what.
I will not support the Anti-Kitten Act. That's true. But there was this, a conformity, or there really was this pressure to, and I don't think that, it's been nearly 20 years, but just about 20 years. Yeah. In September, and I think now we can kind of look back and after 20 years and get some sort of sense of like, oh yeah, I guess we can kind of see what happened there and the problems it caused. We're still dealing with them, but
sure.
So I think it'll take a while. I'm not gonna say it's gonna take 20 years, but it'll take us a while. We have to get out of this sort of moment. We have to get clear of COVID-19, and we have to come to some kind of new sort of consensus about stuff like, how evil the United States is, which is kind of like one of the big culture war, things that are going on now. And kind of get past this particular historical period. It's hard to judge it in the moment. And I don't know how long it's going to take, necessarily to get out of that. But, 5-10 years minimum, I'd say we can look back and kind of say, oh yeah, now I can kind of see what happened in 2020. And, and we'll probably still be dealing with the consequences of that to some extent in, 5-10 years, certainly.
Yeah. Well, I'm in therapy. I have a therapist. I've been going about, once a week for, quite a few years. And for me, I think therapy has been very helpful, just in my own life, where I am forced to basically every week take stock on what happened in that week, how did I respond to stresses or triggers and that sort of thing, and try to figure out, okay, what's going on with me and why am I responding to that? And there've been quite a few times where I've sort of like psychoanalyzed myself, and I'm like, oh, this like I think I've been guilty of projection quite a bit. Where so my wife and I, where we had an offer accepted on a house, right? And this comes after having just the worst experience ever trying to renovate a co-op apartment in Brooklyn. Don't do it. Don't get a co-op ever. Don't try to fix a co-op. Don't do anything. It's the worst thing you could do to my life, and it happened. And the both of us, we were burned so hard, so badly by like everybody on that front. So then moving into this new venture of, oh, it's not an apartment, it's going to be a house, but also we need to fix it up. So now we're wading again into sort of the unknown, where it's like we're a little bit wiser, but we're still not like construction workers. We're still not contractors and all that. So we've been getting into these arguments, and maybe I'm starting them. And what I figured out was I am so like kind of pissed off at myself being like and feeling insecure about being fucked over that I'm sort of I see the same like sort of ignorance in my wife, and I'm like pissed off at her for not, so it's sort of like I'm seeing my own failings in my wife because she's not a fucking expert. So I'm kind of taking it out on her. And it took me, I had to be like, whoa, thank God I'm able to actually see that, where it's like, you know what, I gotta be a lot nicer to her about it
Mhm.
because she's not the enemy, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you for sitting through my little my little therapy session right now. So I
That'll be
bring
$125, by the way. Yeah, so.
well, thank you, cheaper than the guy I go to. But I bring that up in that I don't know how. So I'm struggling already just yeah, as an individual with the loved ones that I have with my small community, right?
Mhm.
The idea of me trying to make sense of this much bigger, macrocosm out there, I can't even wrap my mind around it. And I wonder if so many people are sort of spending their time trying to figure out, the big stuff rather than taking care of the little stuff in their own lives. So that's a roundabout way of getting to that.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I think, one of the things, of course, that's striking about this year in particular is for a lot of us, to differing degrees, and I want to say it's going to be very different for, people that, are able to, work from home as a lot of us have been. I've been fortunate in that I've been able to teach online, which is good. But of course, a lot of people have lost their jobs. They're in much worse situations. So, we all probably feel some degree of powerlessness now over the last year, and some people obviously more than others. And I want to recognize that. Yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of people respond badly when they don't feel like they're empowered and such, and people don't like not knowing stuff, so
Oh my
um
God, that's me.
yeah.
That's who I am.
Well, that's everybody. That's an
Yeah.
easy one. It's kind of like these horoscope like psychology sessions, right? Where you say like sometimes you like being around people and sometimes you like being alone. It's like, oh yeah, that's me. You nailed it. So that's how to be a good psychologist, is just say platitudes. But No, I mean, so I think a lot of people sort of search for meaning in an event like this does come down to, I mean, what has impressed me over this year, and I'm not like a super optimistic about like human nature necessarily. I'm not a pessimist either, but I think of myself as fairly like a realist about it. Is like it's clear from this year that I sometimes joke like I've really like overestimated people's ability to like look at data and make like
Mm.
rational decisions. I mean, this year was like an emotional outpouring. And really sort of defined by fear and anger and confusion and such. And I don't know that I could have, be honest, I don't think I would have predicted it would have been like this bad
Mm.
necessarily. But I think part of it is, when people are sort of disempowered, they want absolute truths. They want simple answers, for why things are the way that they are. Like if only we do X, then the world would be so much better. I mean, I've encountered this, like I've done a lot of research on violence in video games and stuff. And, of course, a big thing around there was this idea that violence in video games was attached to, mass homicides. And there's this
Mhm.
idea of like, if only we get rid of, there usually would be these like, 70-year-old, dudes waving their cane at a kid, crossing their lawn or whatever. And it's like, well, only we get rid of these video games, all these school shootings will just go away. And and I have a kid, and I remember when the 2012 Sandy Hook shooting happened. It was a shooting at an elementary school in Connecticut. And my kid was little at the time. He's 17 now. But I remember thinking like, oh my God, I mean, just the idea of like I had to send my kid to school the next day. I walked
Right.
him to school, and the idea of like not getting him back at the end of the day is so disempowering. It really is a sense of
Right.
like, as a parent, disempowering. Like, yeah, I mean, you want to like grab at something that will give you control over a situation you can't control. Is reality. So people, I think, will tend to glom onto, moral absolute truths or sort of worldviews or narratives that try to explain everything that's happening. And the reality is that things are oftentimes much more complicated, much more nuanced. There are no clear bad guys, no clear good guys, but that's not the world that most of us sort of gravitate towards. We want to know who, we want to know who the Nazis are,
Right.
and if only we get rid of them, or the communists, whatever. And if only we get rid of them, then the world will be peachy. At least that's the story we keep telling ourselves.
Yeah.
And it doesn't come true.
Yeah.
And that can be frustrating too.
Something that I think I like a lot of people, being stuck indoors, spend a lot of time watching Netflix and watching basically any type of programming that they would throw in front of you. And something that my wife and I've been watching a lot of are just these like documentaries about serial killers, right? And I wanted to talk to you about it, because it seems like all these serial killers, they all took place in the 70s. What the hell was going on in the 1970s where, Son of Sam and all these other ones were basically running free? I mean, you talk about, I mean, that's before,
Yeah.
I mean, that's before, the first person shooters, were available, video games.
Yeah, well, the thing about like crime is, of course, certain types. I don't know of a better way of putting it other than to say that certain types of crimes are trendy in the news media, is what I mean. I don't mean in terms of like people's personal preferences. It's really like the news media pick up on a particular narrative about crime, and then they try to drive it. So it wasn't true that there was suddenly serial murder, in the 1970s. There were serial murders before. It's just that they didn't get much news attention. In fact, because particularly a lot of the male killers were sort of sexualized, news media kind of stayed away from it because they didn't like talking about sex in the 40s and 50s and that kind of stuff. But there certainly were cases of serial murder. Essentially, we can trace them back through history, but so it's not a new phenomenon. It's just that sort of news media and the FBI kind of together sort of like discovered it. Like in the same sense you discover oxygen. It was there all the time, you just didn't notice it. And so it became kind of popular to focus in on these serial killers. They still exist today. They're still serial killers. They just don't get news media attention anymore, the way that the people moved on to mass homicides. And then with a lot of these things, there's also a moral narrative. I mean, so like serial murder, to a large degree, fit into this narrative in the 70s and 80s about porn. So there was a lot of concern that porn caused, sexual violence towards women. And so if you look at a lot of the serial killers that got a lot of attention, they tended to be these male sexual predators, at least initially, who were targeting women. And then only gradually did we figure out that, well, there actually are a few, maybe 10% of serial killers are female, and there actually are some like Jeffrey Dahmer who target other men. And such. So it kind of gradually, broadened out. At first, people thought it was mostly white men. Then eventually people figured out, like with Wayne Williams, actually there are, black men and Asian men. So it's not just whites that are doing it. We kind of gone through the same thing with mass homicides. Now it's about gun control. Mass homicides are sort of a nice story to tell if you're concerned about gun control. And kind of we went through a lot of the same kind of, maybe it's about video games, sort of like with the porn thing, or maybe I've seen people talk about, well, mass homicide perpetrators are mostly white. Once again, well, that's not true either. Their ethnic composition is about the same as the United States. So again, people tend to take these crimes and, fit them into a particular moral narrative that they're interested in. And news media kind of run with it. And the problem with news media is we have something in human psychology. It's called the availability heuristic, which basically means if you can remember something, particularly if that thing is dramatic, you will overestimate how frequently it occurs. And of course, airplane crashes are the classic example of that. People tend to think that airplanes are much more dangerous than cars, even though the inverse is really true. Because people can remember airplane crashes. They get a lot of news coverage. They're very dramatic. Hundreds of people die at the same time. It's scary. And mass homicide was kind of like that. They're very, very rare. They're not, most people who are going to get murdered are not going to get murdered in a mass homicide, but they get a lot of news attention, and that can create this sort of, availability heuristic. People overestimate the extent to which, that phenomenon, occurs. And I think we were sort of getting tired of mass homicide a little bit. There really, of course, 2020 was, everybody's isolated, so there wasn't any place to go where there were crowds anyway. So there really weren't very many mass homicides in 2020. But I mean, I think there are some trends, even when we talk about like race and policing, that you can kind of see some of the same issues. Is that there's a narrative now, and news media will kind of focus on specific cases, and that can have a distorting effect on our understanding of these crime phenomena. So you do see crimes tend to go through waves of sort of moral trendiness because they fit into a particular moral concern that some portion of the populace has.
Yeah, I often find anytime I see somebody post like, if blank were blank, this would have happened. And it's like, oh, well, I could actually find exact cases where blank was blank and it did not happen, or, or any number of things that catch the eye, in the public. Just going back to, the serial killers again, because they're still embedded in my mind. With Netflix, it's like the only way, it's either you're going to have a stand-up comedy special on Netflix or a serialized docuseries about serial killers. So you sort of bounce back and forth. I like you said that serial killers have always been around, and there was like sort of the sexual element they didn't want to touch back in the day, so they sort of were a little more dormant. Was there a sort of a convergence of sort of sexual revolution and serial killers that popped in history and came together?
Yeah, I think there was, it did happen around that time where there's a much more liberal attitude towards sexuality that was going on in the 70s. And and I think, again, there also was this, it's kind of hard to believe now. I mean, people were really upset about porn in the 70s and 80s. There was this sort of, it was the golden age of porn, VHS tapes were coming out where you can get your own porn, that kind of stuff, particularly in the 80s. And so people really were concerned about, that impact. There was the Meese Commission, which is the Reagan administration's, sort of hearings about, pornography effects. So I remember as a teenager growing up in the 80s, this was like, it was in the news all the time. It was a huge deal. So I think that, that phenomenon of these men who are predating on, at least it was thought initially, mostly women, that would somehow tie in, and kind of the essence was, well, if only we could get rid of pornography, we could censor it, then these guys would not exist. They're sort of built through a combination of probably abusive homes, but also through their exposure to sexual media, such. And then kind of like the 90s happened, and like there was the internet, and pornography just like was everywhere, and everybody just kind of got used to it. And so, I mean, you still find anti-porn crusaders, but they don't have as much of a voice anymore as they did back in the 80s. I think the narrative just died. Basically everybody can get porn at any point they want to, and the world didn't crack. That rape rates went down rather than up. Domestic violence rates went down rather than up. And so I think that narrative eventually eroded. Now people don't ever really sort of exonerate anything. Nobody says like, hey, for 20 years we made you upset about this thing. Turns out we were, whoops, we were wrong. Porn doesn't seem to have this effect on sexual violence. But then they just move on to the next, our culture just kind of moves on to the next thing. And now it's, in the 90s, there's a crime wave, right? So it was about gun control, and then it was just, things kind of moved on to mass homicides and
gangster rap music. I think that was probably another thing.
A lot of moral panics about media in general. So there's always something, that you can pick on media wise. Most of them turn out not to be true. The most recent one was 13 Reasons Why. People were linking that to teen suicide. Turns out it has no substantial impact on teen suicide rates at any rate. So it's hard to say. Did it never have an impact at any teen anywhere? You can't say that. I mean, it's not how psychology research works. But in terms of like the aggregate effects, on society, we could pretty clearly say that teen suicide rates did not change as a consequence of 13 Reasons Why. And for teens that watch 13 Reasons Why are if anything, less depressed and less suicidal than those that don't. So that's kind of where things end.
And 13 Reasons Why, is that Netflix or Amazon?
Also on Netflix. Everything's on Netflix.
Everything's on Netflix. So I guess, I guess it might. I'm trying to figure out why is it that it's less? Is it because they can afford to watch Netflix? But
I think there's some things on Amazon Prime too, but I can't think of anything.
So we're still still in the pandemic, and I've been seeing a lot of people writing about suicide rates of teenagers during the pandemic, and for one, are suicides going up among teenagers? If so, are we? Is there a chance we're seeing yet another, another freak out where there might not be one?
Probably some degree of freak out. We don't have good numbers yet from the CDC on the suicide rates for 2020. I mean, so there's some preliminary numbers, and I've seen people go back and forth, and so I'm sort of agnostic at this point about. I understand people's concern. I mean, I think the concerns were potentially valid. That with isolation and social distancing, that we may have seen a spike in mental health issues in everybody, not just teenagers. But we don't have any evidence at this point that I'm aware of, at least not solid evidence, I don't think, that would suggest that there has been this sort of spike yet in teenagers. Now, that might change, so that might change once we have clear data on what happened in 2020. So suicide rates in the United States, suicide rates had been going up anyway for the last maybe 5 to 8 years or so. And that's not specific to teenagers. In fact, people my age, so middle-aged adults tend to have the highest suicide rates and had the highest increase in suicide rates over the last 5 to 10 years. This seems to be like the worst period of life. And when I talk to my students, I sometimes half jokes, not really exactly a joke. I'm actually a pretty happy person. I live a pretty good life, but I'll say I get it. I understand why this phase of life is kind of a hard one to some extent. All the safety nets are taken away, and you're responsible for everybody, essentially, even your parents.
Right.
I have an elderly mother at this point, and I'm responsible for her care and such. So it's a weird period of life, So and if you are in that situation where the pandemic hits and you're knocked out of work and you have a family to feed and you have all these responsibilities, I mean, it must be a nightmare for people. So in some ways, I would worry almost more about middle-aged adults than I would teenagers. That's not to say I wouldn't worry about teens at all, of course. But there again, I think sometimes we look at things in isolation and don't look at the larger picture. So I think kind of going back to this idea that social media could cause teen suicide, people looked at this and said, well, teen suicide rates are going up. And also Facebook happened, and Twitter happened, and people kind of make that illusory correlation. And what they're not looking at is but old people are really committing suicide a lot. And they're not high adopters of, I mean, some of them adopt, social media, but generally speaking, they're not as high adopters of technology as teenagers are. So you have to look at the bigger picture, the wider picture, or else it's kind of like the 5 blind men with the elephant, where they're each touching a part of the elephant, and one thinks it's a snake. I don't know. That whole story about if you only see part of the picture, you don't really understand the full scenario. And I think that's what we kind of do with a lot of things. It's confirmation bias, right? The idea is you kind of using that example of if only X, then Y would happen, whatever. And we always look for the cases that fit, so again, with video games and mass homicides, people would look at, cases like Columbine, with 1999, 2 teenagers who played, video games, shot up their high school, and say look, I mean, what more do we need to say? There's an anecdote, right? And the reality is that anecdotes are not evidence, because you can find another, Virginia Tech. It turned out he only played Sonic the Hedgehog. He was not a violent video game player. The Sandy Hook, the guy I was talking about earlier, the Connecticut shooter, he mostly played Dance Dance Revolution. So people will tend to ignore those cases where an anecdote doesn't fit the narrative, and they'll focus only on these anecdotes that do fit whatever sort of worldview narrative that they have. And that's part of human nature. It's confirmation bias. Is we tend to pick the piece of evidence that support what we already think, and we either ignore or are very hostile towards pieces of evidence that don't fit our worldview. And we all do it. I'm no exception, by the way.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like it's one of those things where, the desire to have a simple explanation, it's sort of, okay, if it's easy for me to understand why this happened, maybe it's easier for me to grapple with it. But then the other side of that is, if you make these connections that are too simplistic, it could also have just a completely negative effect on you. Where I mean, we all know people who seem to be, um, blaming every single thing that's gone wrong in their life on some outside force, rather than sort of taking responsibility for it. And that's a dangerous game to play, where it's like, no, you gotta be able to, um, confront even the hardest stories to tell and to accept.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely true too. And again, you can see this in psychology research, is that, if people succeed at something, then they tend to give themselves credit for that. And if they fail at something, it's usually something external that is the responsibility for why they failed. It's sort of like a self-preservation bias. There's a word for it. Of course, I'm totally blanking on it, which is terrible as a psychology professor. It's like one of the most basic terms in social psychology, and I'm totally blanking on it. But there is a sort of sense of like, that's the fundamental attribution bias. There we go. That's what it's called. And we kind of like have the sense of like, when we're successful, it's because of how great we are, and how when we're failing, it's because of how crappy the world is.
Mm.
And that's just kind of how, again, it's a fundamental way that human nature works, and it, for most of us, preserves our sense of self-worth. So it's in the short term, it's kind of a good thing. In fact, when people don't do it and they invert it, that's not so great. That's what people have, like clinical depression, tend to invert that process, and it's not a lovely thing. So it's fairly normal to process, but like a lot of sort of, biases, if you will, or attribution errors, it can lead us into making bad decisions. There are lots of ways that we're sort of programmed, our brains are programmed to try to make decisions quickly. And usually those are adaptive. There's a reason why we have those mechanisms, but they can lead us into mistakes, particularly if we don't open ourselves up to challenging our initial sort of knee-jerk reactions to things.
Yeah, I
And
guess
that's why sometimes it is good to
yeah,
slow down and get data before making a decision.
yeah, I was just about to say, like, if you're, a hunter gatherer on the Serengeti, and you hear, a rustling, you're going to take off, because there's a good chance that there's a lion there ready to eat your ass. But then, well, let's, move forward, tens of thousands of years, and it's like, maybe it's like, no, there's no lion there. There's no lion in the, uh, in your next door neighbor's backyard. Maybe there's some other explanation for, why X or Y is happening. I should have these examples written out beforehand, so they make more sense.
Well, you
Well,
can see that in phobias. You can see that, like,
mm,
just real quickly, that, like you said, I mean, a lot of people are afraid of like snakes, right? And not that many people are afraid of like cars or
right.
electricity, and in the United States, at least, very few people are killed by snakes, and a lot of the people that are kind of had it coming. I mean, they're like the guys that are drunk and they're picking up a rattlesnake and say, look, I got, yeah, you kind of had that one coming to you, but not that we want you to be hurt, whatever, but whereas lots of people are killed by cars and lots of people are killed by, electricity. So some of these things are evolved, reactions to things. 10,000 years ago, you get bitten by a snake that was a rattler or a viper or something like that, you're doomed.
Hmm.
So having that sort of instinctive reaction to those things is good. Even though nowadays it's just sort of, you're going to the zoo and you just feel creepy because you're looking at all the snakes, and it doesn't really help you anymore.
When you're teaching like kids, right? Do you ever, maybe you're not allowed to talk about it, I don't know if do you ever notice something like a problem, in a student, and you're like, ooh, I think they could use some help. What is that relationship like? Do you go around, sort of like psychoanalyzing every every person you interact with, to a certain extent, or are you able to, you know to brush that off, put that aside?
Yeah, for the most part, you could brush it off. I mean, I always sort of joke of, I'd have to charge all these people like I almost did with you, the $125
That's
an hour.
right.
So like, asking a mechanic, do you go around fixing people's cars randomly, or something like that. So no, but sometimes you do get some insights, perhaps. And I think they're, and again, I can't speak for all therapists. Some therapists really may be just fascinated with this idea of like, let me just dissect random people and think of like what they would be like in therapy. For me, it's more of, and it doesn't happen like for everybody necessarily, but sometimes when you interact with somebody, you can get the sense of like, I've met this sort of person before,
Mm-hmm.
and here's what I can expect from them, kind of the thing. So you can kind of get that a little bit from people, because you will see like people's behavior fits into patterns. And the way that some people may introduce themselves to you or talk to you in initial conversation, can give you some predictions about what they might do in the future. They're not all bad, but in some cases they're like, I don't know if I would trust this person, with anything. It usually ends up being, that they get caught doing something, unfortunate at some point in the future.
Yeah,
So.
it's really tough when you know somebody and you care about somebody and you find out that their partner is basically a con man, and it's like, ooh, that's not gonna end well. It's like, because it's sort of like you can't put that back. You can't put that back in the box. It's just it's sort of there. I've said too much. Lou knows someone who's a con man. Will he? Will he reveal his identity? At this point, we're gonna head over to thelouperez.locals.com for an extended conversation. I'm with Chris Ferguson, and he's the author of How Madness Shaped History. So definitely go pick that up.